Hey there, Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Acts video. All right, we're back with the channel Elephants in Rooms. And you guys have been liking these videos. I think this is going to be the third time covering this channel. So make sure to check those out if you've already been, watching this channel. But this video is titled The Real Reason Slavery Died. Great, I'm hoping to hear about how slavery's end was very multifaceted, had a lot of reasons going into it, that also built up over time. I was saying that I was thinking of kind of slavery as a large global trade process, not just like the United States or something. And yes, there are forms of slavery that exist today, but we'll see what he's going to mention. Original video, link down below. Make sure you're checking that out and supporting it. Check out my Originals channel. Just recently started having a lot of fun with it, a lot of fun history content. Mr. Terry Originals, link down below. All right, let's get started. So when talking about this from a global sense, some of the things I would expect to be talked about if we're going to have a multifaceted conversation about this, we can go to the philosophies of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, some of the religious movements from evangelical groups, not religious groups as a whole, because there were those that used religious justification to promote slavery, but specifically the ones that were anti-abolition, but especially the ones that were abolitionists. The mass production and popularity of media, specifically with journalism, newspapers, and also, just printed written materials that exposed a lot of the often untold stories of the horrors of slavery, like Uncle Tom's Cabin from Harriet Beecher Stowe as an example. But then also the journalists that were also documenting that, started to see a lot more of that in the 1800s. The Haitian Revolution as an example of showing a large-scale successful slave rebellion and what that cost France, which will also inspire other revolutions. And at a large economic scale, the Industrial Revolution, which was mechanizing labor in a way that can keep wages low. And with the industrialization, the rise of the industrial class competing for political power over the old school aristocratic land owning nobles that were the most frequent users of slaves. So whether we get to those or not, those are all important facets to consider the end of slavery in the modern era. But let's see what he's got.
This could probably go without saying, but being a slave would have been a really, really bad way to spend your life. But being a slave owner? Well,
by the way, if you're anywhere around my age, did you watch Roots in school? I remember watching that. It was almost like part of the curriculum.
Would have been a really, really bad way to spend your life. But being a slave owner? Well, that doesn't seem like the worst gig in the world. And on a broader level, countries built their economies on slavery.
I mean, I guess you'd say not for that the worst thing to be. I mean, definitely worse to be a slave. But yeah, the economic benefits of that. And also remember, slaves were also expensive. It's not like this massive percentage of people actually owned them, but they could be very centralized into large numbers into plantations. But
world. And on a broader level, countries built their economies on slavery.
Right.
So why did they give it up? I mean, it sounds like it should have been an obvious answer, because it was evil or because people got nicer. But those simple answers don't hold up.
Good. I'm glad he's saying that. It was just this noble thing that people promoted and give them credit for from the moral perspective. But no, still minuscule in the big scale.
Slavery was part of humanity for at least 10,000 years, probably more, and in virtually every part of the world.
Right.
The Greeks did it. The Romans did it.
Yep.
The Chinese, the Arabs, the Africans, even Catholic popes had slaves.
Yep. And a lot of the same similar origins. War captives, that's been a big one in history. People in debt who've had to basically sell themselves into slavery, which can, be temporary. What, of course, does vary over time is things like, is slavery going to be allowed and defined and justified through like racial measures, religion? Is the slave actually considered property, like chattel slavery? Were the slaves assimilated into the society, or were they a other? So many different levels and different justifications for slavery and usages of slavery over history.
At least one had actually been a slave. Virtually every society on Earth had some form of slavery.
Which pope was that, by the way?
And nobody seemed to think twice about it until suddenly they did. And
it wasn't
then,
suddenly.
In about 150 years, it all collapsed. I'm Ken LaCorte, and I try to answer questions that make some people squirm.
He brought up the Emancipation Proclamation there. We'll see if he gets to that, but that was more of a political tool than anything. It only freed slaves in states in open rebellion during the American Civil War, which its largest purpose was to be able to disassociate foreign help from supporting the South, especially the British, who had already abolished slavery in the 1830s, but did not abolish slavery in states that had not yet seceded from the Union.
And today's elephant in the room, why did humanity abolish slavery? It didn't magically become unprofitable. Slaves didn't all escape, and the moral arguments had existed for centuries without much effect. And there wasn't one hero who convinced everyone of its evil.
Right.
Although no human being on earth did more to abolish slavery than this guy. And virtually no one knows his name. So we'll first look at religion and morality, because after...
I don't know who that specific painting is, but there's some people I guess you could bring up that were extremely important. One would be William Wilberforce out of Britain. That's who I would guess maybe bringing up there, but we'll see.
After thousands of years, they did play a role. And then we'll look at how modern slave rebellions changed the cost-benefit analysis, and how all of it changed the economics of slavery. And finally, we'll take a look at one country's crusade that brought slavery to a much quicker end.
If you're talking about rebellions, I'm assuming you'd be talking about Haitian Rebellion, but one country's crusade. If you're not going to talk about Haiti, I wonder if you do talk about the British, but we'll see.
And how that country was influenced by a single viral image. Okay, so for most of
that one's a famous one from I forgot the journalist that had done that big expose in Harper's Weekly, I want to say. One of the biggest publications in the United States. Okay, religion and morality. Yep. But again, was used both to support and condemn slavery.
History, religion and morality were used to justify slavery, not challenge it. And why not? The Old Testament includes rules for how to treat slaves. Jesus never condemned it. Paul told slaves to obey their masters. The Quran regulates ownership and doesn't ban it either. In the ancient world,
in the Islamic world, slavery was permitted, but not amongst other, not from Muslim lands. So you saw those slaves, a part of the Islamic slave trade, coming from sub-Saharan Africa or Christian Europe, especially in the southeastern Europe, around the Balkan regions.
Faith and slavery went hand in hand. It was simply accepted, part of the natural order woven into both scripture and society. The earliest moral and legal codes often priced people by rank. Accidentally kill a noble, pay gold. Kill a slave, pay a whole lot less.
Hammurabi's Code, oldest written law code, talks very specifically about how punishments very much vary depending on your social class.
Worth was pegged to a class or a clan. But things started to change in the Enlightenment age. In the late 1600s,
He's bringing up
intellectuals like John Locke and Voltaire,
points we talk about
laid the groundwork for ideas of liberty, natural rights, and universal reason. Now, these concepts challenged established hierarchies, but even still, most of these early figures, they still either completely ignored slavery or they made exceptions for it.
Yeah,
heck,
I'm glad he said that too. You did see that in so many cases. Yeah, John Locke.
He still either completely ignored slavery or they made exceptions for it. Heck, Locke even invested in slave trading companies while writing about freedom. But Enlightenment reshaped...
I mean, like the French Revolution was like, hey, we're going to abolish serfdom, but slavery may still be permitted in other colonies. Haiti, which was totally a slave colony, was France's most profitable colony. And actually, during the Revolution, when they were like trying to ban slavery, it actually got kind of reversed with Napoleon. Napoleon wanted to come back and like reassert it, which then we're going to get the Revolution. The Enlightenment reshaped how religion was understood and practiced.
In slave trading companies while writing about freedom. But Enlightenment reshaped how religion was understood and practiced. It gave rise to a more personal, conscience-driven morality. And importantly, it reinforced the idea that political institutions should align with moral law. Around the same time, long before slavery became national debates, Quakers were already breaking ranks. They banned owning slaves within their communities. They published tracts and letters condemning it, and they made it theological, not just economic or political. Still, for a long...
Now, in the North there wasn't that's if you're not an American, the Quakers were large up in northern colonies of the American colonies where the slave population was minuscule as compared to the South, and their economy wasn't completely built on it like it was, in the South. not a surprise to see an abolitionist movement in the American 13 colonies happen in the North rather than the South, as it wasn't just the way of life.
Condemning it, and they made it theological, not just economic or political. Still, for a long time, they were the religious exception. Even in the United States, where many churches condemned cruelty, few challenged the institution itself. Again, the Bible had passages that could be viewed either way, so slaveholders used them to defend the status quo. But then came evangelical revival.
Yeah, because, the South was Protestant as well. Enormous sects like, the Baptists.
So slaveholders used them to defend the status quo. But then came evangelical revival. The 1700s saw a surge of emotional, populist Christianity, what historians call the Great Awakening. It didn't just change how people worshiped, it changed what they believed they were supposed to do. Suddenly, personal salvation came with a sense of duty. If your soul had been awakened by God, you couldn't just sit still, you had to act. In America, many Northern abolitionists were products of that movement, and they took it as their duty to fight. That theological divide split national churches down the middle. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, they all fractured into Northern and Southern denominations, often over slavery alone.
You had this also separate into the political parties too, where you had like these Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats, where these Southern Democrats are still going to want to preserve these institutions like slavery and the social status quo.
What's striking is that this moral turnaround happened quickly in historical terms. Just a few decades earlier, most churches were either silent on slavery or totally complicit. Now they were sending missionaries to preach against it, organizing boycotts and circulating petitions with tens of thousands of signatures. Western Christian nations really led the way on this, but they don't necessarily get a great big gold star. These were the same societies that had trafficked millions of people for centuries. But Western Christianity was the first religion to mobilize a sustained activism that eventually forced other societies around the world to follow suit.
I don't know a lot of you know this, but that slave trade that the Europeans ended up getting into was a system that was, being used for slavery. When we're talking about the Indian Ocean slave trade, went on for centuries. We're saying the Islamic slave trade, which entered, that process. And like I said earlier, had rules about slavery. You couldn't enslave other Muslims, but could come from like sub-Saharan Africa, could come from Europe. You may have heard of that, like the Ottoman Empire, that being a big part of the devshirme system, and even, populating their political class and military class with, janissaries who came from a lot of these like Christian land origins. But the slave trade had taken so many slaves, especially from sub-Saharan Africa, head east to coastal cities in the east coast of Africa, the Swahili coast states. And then many of them would go up to kind of the Arab world. Many would go to India, all across the whole Indian Ocean basin. That had gone on for centuries. And Europeans kind of get into that system. And then it expands, of course, into the Atlantic Ocean, where it will be enormous as well. Specifically to justify some of the labor requirements for so much of the plantation agriculture that was going to be happening in the Americas. Sugar, the most profitable of the crops that was coming to be, farmed in the Americas, not indigenous to the Americas, but brought over to the Caribbean islands, because the climate of somewhere like the Caribbean or say Brazil is a climate where you can't, where you can actually grow sugar, as opposed to like anywhere in Europe, which you can't. And the labor intensity of sugar being the major justification for using slave labor for that. Because again, it was so incredibly profitable. Now, sugar not going to be as big a deal in North America. That's where tobacco and then cotton become the major slave products up there. But the highest percentage of slaves that came across the Atlantic was actually in the Caribbean. Whole states over there, again, like the island of Hispaniola, being by far mostly slavery, almost all of it from slave origins. Brazil, again, being the second largest of the destinations. North America, actually, interesting, is actually a much smaller percent. Probably only about 5% ended up going into North America. And just think about how big of an impact that had made on American history. But 5% of the total Atlantic slave trade going to North America. Again, look how big it's been in American history. Just think how big it is in the societies of these other places like the Caribbean or say, Brazil.
But slaves played a role in their freedom as well. Rebellions were large and small, and slaves fought back constantly. And that resistance chipped away at the institution from the inside. Some of it was dramatic and violent. Some of it was quieter. But it all had a cost. And over time, that cost helped make slavery harder to defend, harder to enforce, and harder to afford.
You going to mention any?
Let's start with the big one.
Yeah.
The Haitian Revolution. Good. In 1791, nearly 500,000 slaves rose up against French rule.
Again, context. Early French Revolution. Declaration of the Rights of Man. They're reforming their constitution. Haitians saying, hey, we're part of the French Empire. Doesn't this apply to us? And basically we're told no, in a obvious sign of hypocrisy, I get, from that perspective.
It quickly became war, a brutal 13-year fight that destroyed plantations, decimated French forces, and ended with the creation of Haiti, the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere.
And in a larger scale, because you got to look at the whole history, basically the only long-term successful slave revolt in history. It's amazing to think about, with, like he's saying, thousands of years of history of slavery and how few slave rebellions actually led to long-term successes. But it's going to be very difficult build-up for Haiti. To also get that independence observed by France, they had to pay enormous amounts of reparations for losses from France and plantation owners that immediately put them in a debt that they'll, I don't think, ever get out of, which is going to make them impoverished almost from the beginning. And I think that overshadows, because when you look at the economic state as like Haiti is, and the dire economic and political problems that they've had, I think that overshadows the accomplishment, I guess, of a slave state getting its independence, as violent as it was.
Now, Haiti wasn't just a colony. It was the colony.
Right.
The richest sugar-producing territory on Earth. And to put it in perspective, at its peak, it generated more revenue than all 13 American colonies combined.
That is insane. It just shows you the profit value of sugar, because sugar can grow in these areas down here. Okay, first plantations were with tobacco, and then you're going to get cotton really starts to come on a little bit later. And then especially when you get things like the cotton gin, which just made cotton production so much quicker. But the amount, the profit you could flip from just sugar was just, again, insane, because again, it can only grow in so many places. If you're the British, I mean, okay, yeah, you have to get it from somewhere else, because they get cotton from somewhere else. They also get it from India, the biggest cotton producing place, in the world, and is going to be a colony theirs eventually as well.
Generated more revenue than all 13 American colonies
I did not know that
combined.
Comparison, by the way.
And then it was gone. And that sent shockwaves through the whole slave-owning world.
Right.
And Haiti wasn't an isolated case. 40 years later, in Jamaica, 60,000 slaves sparked an uprising known as the Baptist War. It only lasted 10 days before British troops crushed it, but that rattled Parliament. Yeah. And just a year later, Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act, freeing nearly 1 million slaves across the empire. There's
always context to this stuff, because I've literally heard people, especially on the internet, argue it's like that it purely, like their Slavery Abolition Act purely came out of just this moral realization all of a sudden. But there's always a, I don't know if the word nefarious, but almost like a nefarious context leading up to so much of this stuff. So it's it's not willing to deal with, so do it. And also, Britain's economy is doing fantastic, as it was the first country to industrialize. So not going to be as much of a blow as, say, the French, who are just got over their revolution and are now starting to get their industrialization. But Britain's so, far ahead economically when it comes to producing so much with low labor costs.
Mass revolts like this weren't common, but when they happened, they hit hard. Yeah. They shattered the myth that slavery was stable. They scared investors, and they forced political hands. But slave revolts are as old as slavery itself. The Spartacus Rebellion in 73 BC.
We'll talk about the Zanj Rebellion.
So slaves have always resisted. Why did it now seem to matter in the 18th and 19th centuries?
It was the Zanj Rebellion in modern day kind of Mesopotamia in Iraq. And that was interesting, because there was a slave uprising. This is like the Middle Ages, just so you know the larger context, that they actually took hold of, what city was it? Basra? Is that the one? That's the one that immediately came to my head. that the people that participated in the uprising ended up holding the region for about 10 years. That I believe was the Abbasid Caliphate that ended up putting an end to it, just as their empire was, starting to rise and taking over that region. In fact, just kind of near there is they're going to set up Baghdad as their capital.
Biggest difference? Scale. The Europeans had taken slavery and they really industrialized it. By the 1700s, it had moved from household or urban labor to mass-scale plantations, especially in the Caribbean and the American South. Yeah. That created dense, majority slave population areas, and they were harder to control.
Yeah, slavery in the American South was kind of waning, interestingly. The cotton gin, which is a process to be able to separate seeds from cotton, which was such a labor-intensive thing, even for, manual labor. But when that thing came online, it made cotton even more profitable, therefore slavery even more profitable. Yeah, dang you, Eli Whitney.
And the stakes were higher as well. Cotton, sugar, tobacco exports. These were huge parts of nations' GDPs. A successful revolt didn't just burn a few crops. It could affect a country's entire economy.
You know what's so interesting to think about is like with tobacco and sugar, these are two agricultural products that we don't need. They're actually incredibly harmful for health. And they're like addicted. We are like biologically more drawn to sweets of all the different taste sensations that we're like, we can get addicted to it. And that tobacco obviously only designed basically to be addictive. That those were the two big products that like as a species, we're like very willing to ignore like the moral issues of slavery for those two products. Like I guess with cotton, it's, making it a great textile, but sugar and tobacco.
After the Haitian Revolution, French investors had lost millions and people noticed.
Yeah. There were reparations,
these
though.
were also happening at the same time that new morality was taking hold, and a single rebellion could help shift public opinion and government action. But full-scale revolts weren't the only threat. Every day across the American South and beyond, slaves resisted in quieter, harder to track ways. They worked slower, broke tools, faked illness, and thousands escaped entirely. When they did,
in the modern day, they call that quiet quitting, or one step up from that today, which is work just hard enough not to get in trouble. How many of you do that?
Faked illness, and thousands escaped entirely. When they did, they didn't just disappear. They became part of a network, the Underground Railroad. That was an informal system of routes and safe houses and secret supporters stretching from the south to the north, sometimes into Canada. It helped thousands of people reach freedom, and it made slave owners paranoid.
Canada, British colony, right? Britain is going to abolish slavery. Therefore, Canada going to do it far earlier than the United States by decades.
Because every escape came with a cost. Lost labor, lost capital. It forced owners to invest in tracking them down with rewards and bounty hunters. All of it added up. And the broader security cost was even worse. Southern states poured money into slave patrols, militias, and night riders, charging them with stopping runaways and putting down rebellions before they started. In some places, every adult white male was legally required to serve in a patrol, and large budgets were devoted to it. And the more violent the enforcement became, the more resistance it sparked in return.
Bounty hunters.
It all gradually shifted the equation. What had once been an efficient labor system became a security headache. Now, look, resistance alone didn't bring down slavery, but it made it less sustainable and less stable and less profitable.
Right.
The truth is,
it's like so many changes socially and economically have their roots in economics. When something becomes, not profitable, that's what gets the wheels of motion in history we see all the time.
No economic model, no matter how profitable it is, can survive when it needs to be defended at gunpoint 24/7. And in the end, the system really collapsed when it stopped making financial sense. For centuries, slave labor was the backbone of global wealth. Ancient Rome ran on it, and China, and the Arab caliphates, and the Ottoman Empire, and nearly every colonial power. America's cotton and sugar empires were just the modern face of something that existed pretty much forever. Slaves didn't need wages, and they couldn't walk.
Do have to say there was, again, depending on all the people he brought up there too, also had different policies about slavery as far as being considered as personal property that could be moved like property was. Another one that varied a lot over history was the children of slaves, right? You saw in the West where the children of slaves were also considered legally slaves as well. And other places across history and at different times, that was not the case. Or rules about slaves needing to be from certain like racial or religious groups.
Walk off the job. The model was forever. Slaves didn't need wages, and they couldn't walk off the job. The model was horrifying, but it was efficient.
Not safely.
And as long as the economics work, nobody at the top has much incentive to change it. But eventually, that math stopped working. In 1776, the same year the American colonies declared independence, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, a groundbreaking understanding of national economics. In that book, Smith wrote, "The work done by free men comes cheaper in the end than that performed by slaves." That wasn't a moral claim, but a cost analysis. Smith argued that slave labor seems cheap up front, but it's inefficient, inflexible, and expensive to maintain. You had to first buy a person, then house them, clothe them, feed them, and guard them. And slave labor was fixed. You owned a person whether or not they were productive, or if cotton prices dropped, or if the overall marketplace changed somehow. On the other,
yeah, because it's like, how do you increase it in the economic world? I guess you'd fire that person and replace them, hopefully, with somebody that can do that. But you can't do that with slavery. Like with a slave, you could fire them. I mean, you try to motivate them with punishments, but this still may not actually make them better. And, firing them, letting them go, that it's not like you just replace them. Or if you do, it becomes even more expensive. So, yeah, I don't really think of it that way, but that makes total sense.
Productive, or if cotton prices dropped, or if the overall marketplace changed somehow. On the other hand, hired labor is plug and play. Workers move to where jobs are. They can learn new skills more easily. They can be hired and fired on demand. This was especially true as the Industrial Revolution changed how people worked.
Yep.
Paid labor became cheaper.
And travel became cheaper. So you could be somebody where it's not industrializing. They move to another country because travel is so much cheaper. You got trains, steamboats going across oceans, who are then going to be a new low paid labor source. We saw that be a huge thing in the United States. Low wage laborers coming from other parts of the world, coming in at about the lowest wages that somebody could survive off of, which is essentially what your economic cost of slave labor would be, right? Actually, it's even lower. You just got to pay them that wage, and then they have to deal with, the food and the protection and all that. And you don't have to worry about them coming in and doing a slave revolt or something similar to that. I mean, I guess you could have a worker strike, and that was the closest thing, I guess you would say, to like a slave rebellion in the industrial world when we're talking about the impact of, losing large amounts of your labor in order to improve social and economic conditions.
Industrial Revolution changed how people
This has been really good so far, by the way.
Paid labor became cheaper. And we saw this on a macro scale as well. When Britain abolished slavery, that didn't trigger some economic meltdown. The British government paid former slave owners millions in compensation, equal to about 40% of the national budget. It was one of the largest wealth transfers in British history. But despite the payout, and despite losing access to free labor across the empire, Britain's GDP surged. So did exports, investment, and industrial output.
Well, Britain also put a lot of pressure on other countries to do that too, because they're like, hey, if we're going to abolish it, like, we don't want the rest of you to we don't want the rest of you to be doing that too, because there's economic competition. It's like, if we're not going to do it, then y'all shouldn't be doing it either. Oh, and another reason we don't want you to be doing that, to do your own production, is so you can buy our stuff, the British stuff. Right, the British want to be the greatest exporters in the world, and if these other places in the world are using this type of like slave labor to produce their own goods, that hurts the competitive element for Britain's nationalistic goals and economic goals.
The American South fought to keep slavery, but the North had already moved far past them, building factories, canals, and a growing urban workforce. The Northern economy didn't need to own people; it just needed to rent their time.
Didn't in large scale for production.
Leaner, and more adaptive than the plantation system. In the years after the U.S. Civil War, the national economy surged, and the country entered one of the biggest growth periods in its history. And the South? still lags behind.
Yep.
Look at Brazil, which was the last major country in the
88.
Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. When it did, it was already falling behind and it never had fully industrialized during the 1800s.
Yes, I was going to say their lack of industrialization, the lack of industrialization across South America being a huge problem of that. They're still going to be, even into their independent years, which, you know, start in early 1800s, early to mid for most of the countries in South America, but not industrializing for whatever reasons, both consciously and because they weren't possible. But also, like we were saying, Brazil had a much bigger economy when it comes to the reliance on slave labor than, again, the United States, especially as compared to their work population. Or again, we were talking about like in North America, where only about 5% of slaves ended up going. Because to Brazil, it was 40 to maybe like 45% of all the slaves that came out of Africa came to Brazil, and was such a large percentage of their economy and their workforce. You know, abolishing that, you know, as early as maybe a lot of these other countries did that already had the Industrial Alliance and a significantly larger population of, you know, freed people, would make it a lot less economically motivating than it was in other countries. But yeah, all the way in the 1880s, so a good 20 years after the United States did.
Its economy stayed tied to agriculture. It preserved slavery at the cost
still did
of
a lot of importing.
and it paid the price. Eventually, even slave owners saw the writing on the wall. Slavery wasn't just morally indefensible, but it was becoming morally obsolete. But we have to be careful in thinking of the economics of slavery
There's still plenty
as
of
a
ways I'm sure
standalone
people could
factor.
have
It's where the rubber
morally
meets the
justified
road,
it.
but it's also intertwined with everything else. It's like asking why a restaurant failed and being told that it ran out of money. I mean, yes, but you can't
Where's the
separate
lamb
that
sauce?
from the food being bad or a location being a problem.
Yes.
Still, there's a bit of an uncomfortable truth that the system didn't die just because we became better people.
Thank you. Thank you. I get so tired of this argument because it's just not rooted in reality. People want their views and their ancestries to be validated. And you don't stop doing that. You are not your ancestors. You have nothing to do with them. And I think that's something that you're saying about uncomfortable truth, is like trying to tie that to your own identity, which is so stupid. Stop doing that, people. You didn't choose to be born. You just happened to be in the place that you were in the world. You did not make some early conscious decision of, I'm going to be born at this time in this place because I want to be connected to that ancestry. No. Ken's spitting in this video.
A bit of an uncomfortable truth that the system didn't die just because we became better people. It officially died because it lost a competition. Paid labor beat slave labor. And once the numbers changed, the moral argument started winning. In the same vein,
started winning, it became easier to do it. But it was not the first domino pushing here. It becomes a lot easier to make moral changes when the previous moral framework no longer is beneficial anymore. I know that sounds very cynical, but...
And once the numbers changed, the moral argument started winning. In the same vein, we can't minimize the moral stances. Look at the United States. No other country ended slavery the way America did, by killing each other by the thousands. About 600,000 people died in the Civil War. That's roughly equal to every other American war in history combined.
But about preserving the Union, you know, how many people in the North were enlisting in the army? Be like, I'm going to go down to this place I've never been to and fight because of slaves and people I don't know in a system that I've never even experienced before. Let's not say it was a moral crusade necessarily. Preservation of the Union. But you get that pushing and it makes a lot easier argument to say, okay, here's here about abolition or abolishing your peculiar institution. Literally called it that.
In the Civil War. That's roughly equal to every other American war in history combined. Entire cities were leveled. And underneath it all was a fight over slavery. Now, I know that there are some who say that the war was fought over economics or other reasons, but it's just historically wrong. The South fought to preserve slavery, and the North fought to keep the country together without it.
The North fought to keep the country together without it. Yeah, I think that's a better way of framing it. especially looking at it from the perspective of those in charge of it, say like the president, like Lincoln, right? Maybe not as much as the people that are going to join up, but also remember there's conscription drafting here. And that became debated for a lot of people in the South, where it's like, I'm, like for so many people that were, poor, that again, you had to be incredibly rich to own like considerable slave numbers. And there was an argument by people fighting in the South that were getting conscripted into this war where it's like, why am I fighting for this other guy to be able to own slaves when I can't do it? I'm this like low wage worker with no kind of social or economic mobility. Oh, and by the way, that there are ways to get out of service. If you ever heard of that before, a lot of the family members of slave owning families found exemptions to get out of the war by paying their way out of it. One was literally kind of like almost rewarded slave owners. It ended up becoming known as the 20 Negro Law, which said that if you were a plantation owner and you owned 20 slaves, you could be exempt because what the justification they said was there had to be adequate supervision of the plantations. If you have 20, slaves, you need a person there to supervise it. But it was incredibly resented by poor white Americans of the Confederacy because of the hypocrisy of it, of defending an institution that they don't actually participate in. Like I said, too, you could pay to get somebody to take your place, which made it disproportionately, a war fought by poor people for an institution that can only be practiced by rich people.
Fought to preserve slavery, and the North fought to keep the country together without it. Every other rationale was downstream of that reality. And in America, Abraham Lincoln is known by everyone for being the pivotal man to make that happen. But worldwide, no human being deserves more credit for ending global slavery than a man I'm kind of ashamed to admit that I hadn't heard of before. William Wilberforce, who was a short, sickly British politician who spent 20 years hammering Parliament to end the slave trade. Every year he introduced a bill.
I'm gonna be honest too, I don't know much that other than he was just a instrumental figure. So like Ken, I'll be honest, I'm a little bit ignorant to it, to him. So we'll see what he says.
Who spent 20 years hammering Parliament to end the slave trade. Every year he introduced a bill to abolish it, and every year it
failed. What were his arguments?
But he kept going and organized and led boycotts.
Purely from a moral standpoint?
He changed the political culture of the most powerful empire on Earth.
From an economic standpoint?
When slavery was officially outlawed across the British Empire in 1833, Wilberforce died 3 days later. He didn't free every slave, but he shifted the global norm. What had been a near universal institution became, for the first time in history, morally radioactive.
He said after, right? It was 3 days after it was abolished. There has to be some quote from him, right? About like on his deathbed or whatever. Or did he die suddenly? If he was sick or whatever. Again, I have no idea. I have to imagine there's some quotes or something about like, I finally lived long enough to see it, By the way, the British had actually abolished the slave trade in their empire back in 1807, I want to say. But again, that was actually fairly common to like ban slave trade before the institution of slavery. United States was doing that. When the Constitution was created, for example, they said that the slave trade would end in 20 years from that point. It wouldn't ban slavery, but it would end the slave trade. So that happens decades before the Civil War in the 1860s.
And one early tool he used was essentially a viral image. Abolitionists had printed a cutaway drawing of the slave ship Brooks.
I show this
simple black and white engraving showing 454 enslaved Africans
in my classes,
packed below deck like cargo, row after row.
Oh, I think I was, at the beginning I was saying how there was a big Harper's Weekly expose, and I think that was from now that I'm thinking about it, from a different famous document. Anybody know the article that was there? It was very profound. And it actually, it had this journalist that actually was on, he was documenting and researching what the Middle Passage was like. That's the passage that of African slaves coming from Africa across the ocean. And he talked about like the horrors of that and everything that he had witnessed about, the conditions, the slave ship conditions, and the health conditions. I forget who that author was, but there was a Harper's Weekly one. But yeah, this one interesting too. And we show this. I show this in my class. It's a very popular document in the AP classes for interpretation, and it's just the whole idea of it is to show you how a ship that looks like, from these diagrams, looks like it's a cargo ship in the way that it's so packed. But remember, these are human beings. Now, the most deadly, when you talk about percentage of enslaved people that died on the during the Middle Passage, was especially high at the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. You may end up losing on your slave ship 50% due to health issues. And from the economic standpoint, for the investor, that was a big loss of money if that was to happen. So by necessity, they had to start to improve the conditions just to the point of profitability. Right now, these are never going to become passenger cruise ship type of conditions, but enough to make it profitable, because it was still about trying to keep your expenses very low, because the more improved conditions or fewer people you have on the ship cuts the bottom line. So it was about finding that balance. But by the end of the slave trade, I think the death of enslaved people during the Middle Passage probably got down to about, I think maybe it was down to the single digits for sure, maybe even around like 5%, but not from some moral conviction, but from economic necessity.
54 enslaved Africans packed below deck like cargo, row after row of bodies laid out in perfect, horrifying symmetry. It was distributed in pamphlets, newspapers, and passed around homes and churches across the country. For the first time, ordinary Britons could see what the Atlantic slave trade looked like in brutal.
And remember, this is built upon, this is like the kind of that first era of mass published media. This is that kind of earliest time in history where like newspapers were cheap and widely read now in an increasingly literate society across the Atlantic world. So that would have been so necessary because, okay, go back a century or two when you didn't have the mass production of these newspapers and literacy rates. People were very ignorant to what these conditions actually were like. And this is now forcing it into the households of people and forcing them to confront this reality.
Detail. And it worked. Within months, Parliament received Britain's first mass petition against the trade. Over 100,000 people signed it, a huge amount of people for that era. It helped abolition become a political movement. And when that movement became law, Britain implemented its new crusade around the world with force. Now, before completely banning slavery, Parliament first passed the Slave Trade Act, banning the buying and selling of slaves across the British Empire. British ships could no longer transport slaves, and British merchants could no longer profit from it. It struck us.
Yeah, and I think and we'll see if he gets to it, started trying to like police the waters of it. But again, what can you do about other countries' laws having to do with slavery? I mean, nothing. So they're going to put pressure on other countries. We'll see if he frames it around like the moral thing, though, or just for economic competition. They don't want others to be doing it, because that's a huge reason why they're going to want to pressure other countries.
Transport slaves, and British merchants could no longer profit from it. It struck a serious blow to the transatlantic slave trade. And the Royal Navy launched the West Africa Squadron, a permanent patrol mission designed to hunt down illegal slave ships along the African coast.
Yeah.
For nearly 60 years, the squadron chased smugglers, boarded vessels, and liberated captured Africans mid-journey.
So here's what's happening. It's piracy. So, for example, just because the British put on the books that they're abolishing the slave trade doesn't mean that there still wasn't a demand for it. When there's a demand, people are going to find a way to do it. So let's say you're a plantation owner in one of these other colonies, maybe even a British colony. It's like you still wanted to find a way to, get slaves in. And there's going to be plenty of people that will go on their own, even if it's illegal, to do this type of illegal trade. I mean, it's literally what smuggling is. In those early years of European piracy known as privateering, you had state-sponsored pirates going around looting ships and of enemy countries, especially like against the Spanish, who were killing it when it came to extracting wealth out of the Americas. became such a political problem amongst countries because European countries were all doing that to each other that they had to mutually agree that, okay, we're not going to do these type of sponsored piracy efforts. But there was still plenty of a demand on it. So what happened? A lot of these privateers and other people are like, well, we'll just do it anyways. And maybe it's even more beneficial because now I don't got to give my cut to the government for, trade or for seizing, treasure ships and stuff. They started doing it their own. It didn't end piracy. It just ended the legal process of it. And I would assume for here, because you still had a slave trade going on after 1807, that, yeah, it was illegal, but people were going to find a way. You just ended the legal slave trade.
And chased smugglers, boarded vessels, and liberated captured Africans mid-journey. Wasn't easy. Slave ships were fast, and the West African coastline is massive. But over that time, they seized over 1,600 slave ships and freed more than 150,000 Africans. Wow. In the process, about 1,500 British soldiers died. And it wasn't cheap either. At times, the squadron absorbed up to half of the entire Royal Navy's operating budget. So at the height of its global power, Britain, an empire built on maritime supremacy, devoted half its naval resources to stopping the very trade it had once run. Now, they had some self-interest going on here as well.
Yes, I'm glad he's saying
because
this.
Because abolition didn't just clear Britain's conscience, it also extended its influence. By patrolling African waters, Britain strengthened its naval dominance in the Atlantic. It countered French, Spanish, and Portuguese rivals, and it built diplomatic leverage over other nations. Here's an example of how it worked. In the mid-1800s, Cuba and Brazil were still major slave economies, but their lifelines depended on transatlantic imports, and Britain was choking off that supply.
Yeah, but a lot of countries, were doing that. Portuguese first to be doing it, Spanish, etc. But anyway.
The Navy captured slave ships bound for both, and British diplomats pressured both governments. Eventually, both nations caved. Now, would that have happened without British pressure? Yes, but likely years later. Abolition in Latin America didn't spring from mass revolts or internal religious campaigns. It came from external force, and that force came from Britain. Again, Britain's leadership on abolition wasn't purely altruistic, but when morality, money, and muscle aligned, it was effective. By the mid-1800s, the same system that had once seemed eternal was suddenly under siege. Militarily, diplomatically, and morally. By 1900, legal slavery had disappeared from almost every modern country. But
now, this might also make it sound like the British were the first to abolish slavery, which is not true. You already heard about Haiti in the Western Hemisphere, but other Western Hemisphere hemispheric countries such as Mexico, Santo Domingo, which is the Dominican Republic, sharing the same island with Haiti, by the way. The Gran Colombia, which was in the northern South America, which won't last as long. It'll end up breaking apart, but that will remain. Bolivia, Uruguay. And then actually some states in the United States had banned it much easier too. Some of those include Vermont, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey. And then in Europe, before the British had done it, you had France, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, though it continued there in their other colonies. Now, France has the caveat of like abolishing it, getting reinstated by Napoleon, but then they do go back. But I think that was that when they reinstitute the slavery ban, that was actually after the British, because that was back in 1848, I believe. Russia is more the peculiar one because they still had serfdom. But anyways, a lot of countries had done it before the British. But like as he was saying, why he added muscle to that list, they actually had the power to impose abolition movements in other countries, while those other countries, I just mentioned, did not do that or attempt to do it or have the power to do it. So that's where the British do stand alone a little bit.
Didn't disappear everywhere. In fact, Mauritania didn't officially outlaw slavery until 1981 and didn't criminalize it until 2007. And there are good reasons to believe it still exists. How large was the
slave population there?
Britain profited hugely from slavery. And what
were the laws around it?
More than any other nation on earth, it brought slavery to an end. In the end, multiple parts of the world changed, and slavery just couldn't keep up. Reason and faith reframed the entire picture. Resistance rose, and profits shrank. And Britain, of all nations, threw its weight behind a global rule change. All of that made slavery unprofitable on multiple levels, and the system broke. Some scientists say the same thing is happening with humanity at large, and that we're headed for extinction. Now, I'm not sure if I buy that, but the whole population crisis that I heard about all of my life, that's not happening anymore. The world will soon be losing people, and for some countries, like South Korea, it's a serious problem that they don't know how to solve. It's worth a look. Hey, thanks for watching. If you made it this far, I think you're in the right place, and I hope you come back again.
Final thoughts. All right, I thought this was fantastic, actually. You know, the things I had mentioned at the very beginning of the video, he nailed them. Bringing it a much more nuanced conversation that needs to be had about slavery, why it happened, how it's happened, I guess, over history. He didn't necessarily talk about that as much about what the institutions of slavery, how they differed over time. You know, what was different about what slavery was like in the transatlantic slave trade, but then how did that differ from, say, the Islamic slave trade from before, Roman slavery, Greek slavery, etc. But I guess that wasn't the point of the video. That would be worthy of another video if, you know, he was to do one like this. Was how is the era of this transatlantic slave trade similar and different to forms of slavery in the past? Because that's often misunderstood or just not understood at all. But I thought this was fantastic. He hit the talking points I would have. Hopefully I was able to add a little bit more depth and maybe balance out, at least in my perspective, where some of those things should go into. One thing I would put a little bit more stress on when I was talking about how Britain was trying to sort of enforce this around the world was the economic competition between other countries. It'd be economically hurting them in a competitive sense to still have these elements of slavery exist in competitive countries. So it almost trying to like create a even playing field where it's like, if we're not going to use slaves, then you shouldn't either. And then we're on this like even competitive economic playground, which they're going to want because the British were very motivated by that for sure. But anyways, again, fantastic video. If you guys are liking me covering Ken's videos, what should I cover next? Let me know down below. And actually the best place to get videos to my attention is on our community Discord server. It's linked down below. There's a video suggestions channel in there. I check that daily. Sometimes stuff in the YouTube section can kind of get lost. I mean, I post videos every day. So no matter what, though, thanks for watching. See y'all next time.